Violets are modest things, quiet, fragrant, easy to overlook. But in the wrong hands, even something delicate can become a message or a weapon. This is a story about memory, obsession, and the kind of silence that kills slowly. In the brownstone, a bouquet meant more than it seemed, and outside it, a manuscript whispered secrets someone would do anything to bury. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. It was one of those rare, blessed mornings when nothing required explanation, persuasion, or motion. Wolfe was in the plant rooms. I was on page 6 of the Gazette, and the bacon Fritz had laid down still lingered faintly in the air, a harmony of domestic satisfaction. The only dead body was in the paper, a bookbinder from Queens with his head bashed in by a brass elephant. Interesting, but distant. For once, it wasn't our circus. The front bell rang at 9:44 a.m., early enough to be unwelcome and just late enough to be significant. I gave it a 3-second grace period, hoping it would go away, but the chime repeated with the patience of someone not planning to. Wolfe's voice, disembodied and disapproving, came from the hallway. "Archie, if that is another vendor attempting to peddle vacuum attachments, please send him directly to hell." I folded the paper with care and rose. "If it is, I'll throw him into the elevator myself." The bell rang again. Whoever it was, they weren't selling. They were insisting. She was wearing grey kid gloves, which wouldn't have been notable if it hadn't been June, and if her entire presence hadn't been tuned to the frequency of deliberate disapproval. The gloves, the hat with a netted veil, the tailored charcoal suit, all of it declared she didn't just have a problem, she'd already decided no one was going to take it seriously enough. "Hilda Morrow," she said, as if we were supposed to know her. "Chelsea, West 24th, I run a gallery." I guided her in. She didn't sit until I gestured, and even then it looked like an act of compromise. The gloves stayed on. "My assistant found them yesterday," she began. "A bunch of violets, carefully arranged, tied with twine, left on the settee of an installation called The Murder Room." She said it like capitals were part of the crime. "An art piece?" I asked. "A historically grounded tableau," she corrected. "A reconstruction of a Victorian domestic murder scene. Very stylized, very precise. That's why it matters. The violets weren't part of the exhibit. Someone added them." I stole a glance toward the hallway, but Wolfe hadn't stirred. "And you think this was what?" I asked. "Artistic feedback?" She removed her gloves slowly. "I think it was a message." She explained it with a curator's clipped precision. The Murder Room was the anchor piece of her summer series, a lavish recreation of an 1890s parlor where a fictional husband had been killed in cold, richly carpeted silence. Velvet curtains, a fainting couch, ornate gas sconces, every object hand-selected, period-authentic, morbidly tasteful. The exhibit was meant to immerse the viewer, to conjure a ghost story in still life. But someone had crossed the line from theme into threat. The violets, fresh, real, and tied with waxed twine, had been placed not casually but deliberately on the settee facing the false hearth, a detail added with knowledge and intention. "Too precise to be vandalism," she said, "and too poetic to be random." Wolfe would have called it theatrical indulgence. I called it interesting. "And then there's Quentin," she added, almost as an afterthought, though her voice wobbled when she said it. "Quentin Vale," she clarified. "The novelist. He's been consulting on the exhibit. He wrote the story that inspired it. And he's missing." "How missing?" I asked. 3 days, no calls, no notes. He was supposed to deliver the final edits on the descriptive plaque last Friday. Nothing. She adjusted her gloves again, though she hadn't taken them off. "He's reclusive, yes, but not careless and not cruel. Something's wrong." I watched her. There was fear in her voice, but it wasn't panic. It was tightly wound, cultured, controlled. "And you think the violets are connected to his disappearance?" "I don't think," she replied. I suspect, and I don't like what I suspect. Wolfe finally emerged as I was pouring her a second cup of tea, which she hadn't asked for and wouldn't drink. He stood at the threshold, arms behind his back like he'd been summoned to his own drawing room. "Madam," he said, "you believe that someone left flowers in a simulated murder scene as a symbolic act connected to the absence of a novelist who dabbled in death as fiction." "Yes," she said, rising. "And you have no body, no blood, and no demand. Number, but I have violets." He sighed. "So do we, madam, in a dozen varieties. If murder required scent, the orchid would have long since been outlawed." I said, "She thinks it was a message." Wolfe turned toward me with a grimace. "Archie, a message without a decipherable symbol is not a message. It's decoration. You may escort Miss Morrow out with civility." She bristled. "If I find his body, will that convince you?" "No," Wolfe said flatly. "But if you find his killer, I'll consider it." That ended it. She took her gloves, her bag, and her worry, and left in a cloud of cultivated offence. Once the door had closed and her perfume had evaporated into whatever ghostly trail it intended to leave behind, I leaned on the edge of my desk and waited. Wolfe had returned to his chair, grumbling about interruptions and malformed narratives. He dismissed the entire episode as curated melodrama and reached for his copy of Pliny like it was a life preserver. But something about those violets, fresh, tied, and staged in a room designed to remember death, clung to the edge of my brain. Hilda Morrow might have been 5 parts performance, but she hadn't been lying, not completely. I didn't bother to argue. Wolfe was done for the day, and his opinion was concrete. So I made a quiet note in my pocket calendar and circled tomorrow morning. Chelsea, gallery, murder room, violets. The gallery sat on a narrow corner lot in Chelsea, half covered in ivy and overconfident press quotes. Inside it smelled like new paint and old intentions. The murder room was exactly as described, lush, theatrical, and claustrophobically accurate. The settee was the kind of thing you'd expect someone to faint on after discovering a bloodied teacup. The revolver under the glass had no chamber, but plenty of menace. The lighting was low and patient, but it was the violets that stopped me. There they were, placed gently on the settee's embroidered cushion, bound with twine, still dewy at the stems, with a scent just beginning to turn heady. Too fresh. Someone had been here. Recently, carefully, with purpose, and not, I suspected, for the sake of art criticism. I walked the room twice. No security cameras, no posted guard, just velvet and suggestion. Then something odd. The wall behind the hearth didn't quite match the others. The paneling was perfect, but the acoustics were wrong. I knocked once and heard the sound change. I don't carry tools, but I carry fingers. And these found the edge of the panel like they'd been trained to. The hidden panel gave with a reluctant click, not theatrical, not dramatic, just solid wood accepting its compromise. Inside was a narrow cavity, barely deep enough for a man, but that's what it held. Quentin Vale, dead. His body was curled sideways, one arm collapsed beneath him like a broken metaphor. His glasses, horn-rimmed and still dusted with powder, were shattered beneath his cheek. The smell in the space was sharp and wrong. Not rot, not yet, but the first whisper of it. There was no blood trail, no chaos, no performance. Whoever had placed him here had done so with efficiency, not rage. I stood for a moment longer, then stepped back and closed the panel with a finality that didn't feel earned. Back in the velvet hush of the murder room, the violets still waited on the settee. I reached for my notebook and dialed the brownstone. When Fritz answered, I said only, "Tell Wolfe the fiction's turned to fact. We've got our body." Back at the brownstone, I made the mistake of entering first. Wolfe was seated in his usual throne, surrounded by his usual disapproval. His brows met like opposing counsel, and the only sound in the room was the slow, deliberate turn of a newspaper page, one I'd already read and discarded. "You appear," he said at last, "unbloodied. Don't I always?" I dropped my hat on the cabinet and stood near the globe as if I had somewhere to be. Found Quentin Vale. Unfortunately, he was already past offering autographs. "I do not require reminders of your proclivity for errant excursions," he said, folding the paper and laying it down as if it, too, had disappointed him. "But to trespass upon a murder scene without permission or purpose—" "There was purpose. Yours, not mine." I could see he was gearing up for a lecture on the sanctity of orchids, domestic order, and uninvited cadavers, so I cut in. The body was behind a wall panel in a replica Victorian murder room. Neat shot to the chest, glasses under him, violets nearby. If that's not theatrical, I don't know what is. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. "Then perhaps you should join the theatre." Quentin Vale already did. He just closed his final act. Wolfe opened his eyes again, sharper now. "And the script?" It was the only thing I'd brought back besides trouble. I handed him the manuscript. Wolfe took the thick sheaf of typewritten pages with the same disdain he reserved for modern music and undercooked veal. He did not thank me, he never does, but his fingers flattened the cover with surprising delicacy, like a priest handling sacrament. "Violet Interlude," he read aloud, "an uninspired title. Try the first few pages before you damn it on aesthetics." He didn't answer, but his eyes dropped to the text, and for a blissful quarter-hour I had the office to myself, save for the rustle of paper and the sound of Wolfe's conscience digesting narrative. By the time he reached page 17, his brow folded like a linen napkin in Fritz's hands. "Pfui," he murmured. "Trouble in prose?" "It is not prose that troubles me." He turned a page with the same disdain he might apply to a lukewarm bottle of beer. This man was attempting something unbecoming of his talent, confession masked as fiction. He lacked the fortitude to do either cleanly. "Meaning?" He did not look up. "It means, Archie, that this is not merely a story. It is a dossier, and I suspect it was not meant for the reader, but for someone else entirely." The front bell rang with all the subtlety of a fire alarm, and when Fritz opened the door, the smell of cigar smoke preceded Inspector Kramer like a particularly pungent herald. He didn't wait to be invited in, he never does, and when he entered the office his eyes found me first, which was fair, because I was the source of his grievance. "You've got a hobby, Goodwin," he barked. "Bodies on Wednesdays?" "Just filling the gaps in your schedule, Inspector." Wolfe didn't rise. He rarely did, especially not for law enforcement. "If you came for an apology, you'll leave empty-handed." "I came," Kramer said, producing a crumpled notebook, "because your man here found Quentin Vale dead in a gallery exhibit, and instead of calling us right away, he took notes. Hell, he probably had a sandwich." "I did not," I said. "But now that you mention it—" "Enough," Wolfe said. He steepled his fingers. "Was the death ruled as suicide?" Kramer grunted. "Not yet. We've got the coroner working on it. No note, no powder burns. But I'll tell you this. Vale's publisher's already making phone calls about posthumous rights. That alone should land someone in jail." Wolfe's lip curled. Capitalism's thirst for corpses is older than Rome. He turned back to the manuscript, though Rome had better taste in prose. "You have no business here," Wolfe said coolly, still without looking up. Kramer scoffed. "Don't tempt me. If Vale was murdered, then the matter deserves attention. If he shot himself, you may safely return to chasing pickpockets and corrupt aldermen." Kramer snapped his notebook shut. "We'll see what the autopsy says. Meanwhile, your sidekick here better not find another corpse before lunch." "That," I said, "depends on the timing of lunch." The door shut behind him with satisfying finality. Wolfe finally put the manuscript down, his fingers drumming the edge of the desk like an idle conductor awaiting the next movement. "Archie," he said, "you will remain available this afternoon. This warrants consideration." I nodded, pretending not to be surprised. When Wolfe says something warrants consideration, it means the wheels are turning. And when those wheels turn, somebody, sooner or later, gets flattened. By late afternoon, the coroner's report had been relayed over the phone. I took the call and passed it along in Wolfe's direction with the efficiency of a man delivering a warm plate to a fussy gourmand. "Ballistics confirmed downward trajectory," I said. "Quarter-inch entry under the left clavicle, powder traces on the shirt, not on the skin. No suicide note, and no residue on the hands." "Ah!" Wolfe sipped beer and contemplated the ceiling as if it held the final chapter of human folly. "Then Vale did not commit suicide. He was executed." "By someone taller." "Or someone standing. Vale was seated." I watched his expression shift by degrees, no dramatic gestures, no cinematic grimace, just the faint satisfaction of a mind that had already drawn the arc from page 17 to a smoking gun. "Murder," he said at last, as if correcting a menu misprint. "Now we may proceed." Hilda Morrow arrived precisely at 5, her gloves still on, her lips painted with the same dry precision as her tone. She had the look of a woman determined not to be overwhelmed by either tragedy or New York humidity. "I assume you've heard," she said, declining the chair Wolfe didn't offer. "I have heard you discovered the body," Wolfe replied. "Mr. Goodwin merely confirmed it." She gave me a glance that could curdle cream. Quentin Vale was more than a collaborator. He was... "A repository of secrets?" Wolfe interrupted gently. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Wolfe closed his eyes as if tasting a sour vintage. "Then the question is not why he died, but why now? Someone feared exposure." "Who?" she asked. He opened his eyes. "That, madam, is precisely what I intend to find out." Her silence was the kind you respect, not probe, and when she finally left she did so like a woman leaving a confessional with more sins yet to admit. Vincent Creel was a novelist with one foot in academia and the other in self-pity. He claimed Vale stole one of his unpublished stories in 48. The courts disagreed. He didn't. Beatrix Vale, widow, kept her voice level and her posture upright. She hadn't seen Quentin in 2 years, but she still wore his initials on her cuff. A habit or a reminder? Delia Petrosian spoke like someone who had practiced silence. She designed the murder room scents and once designed Quentin's cologne. Their relationship, like perfume, was complicated and clung longer than expected. Darren Squires looked like a kid left behind in an empty train station, pale, polite, and visibly rattled. He'd found the violets. He hadn't stopped shaking since. The evidence bag had been delivered that morning, shirt, jacket, and spectacles, all neatly sealed. I placed them on Wolfe's desk without comment, and he made no move to touch them until after lunch. He opened the bag with reluctant fingers, leaned in, and inhaled once, deeply. "Not standard," he said. "Not Delia's mix?" He shook his head. "Not entirely." "Then what?" "Orris root and musk, but with a third note. Synthetic, faint, illegal in certain circles." I raised an eyebrow. "Illegal?" "Methyl eugenol. Restricted since 1958, only used by perfumers with European licensing or in certain archaic formulas. Like the one Quentin wore?" He didn't answer. Instead, he resealed the bag and leaned back. "Someone crafted a memory with violence and fragrance. The scent of murder, Mr. Goodwin, is no longer metaphor." And with that, Wolfe picked up the manuscript again, his eyes already several chapters ahead of mine. If Beatrix Vale were trying to throw off a tale, she was doing a masterclass in composure. Not once during the 5-hour circuit did she break stride, double back, or offer me so much as a glance over her shoulder. Either she hadn't noticed me, which I doubted, or she had and simply considered me beneath commentary. I've been treated worse by baronesses. Her schedule read like a society column on sedatives. First, a planning session for a charity auction at the Harmonia Club, where she held court among elderly matrons with better jewellery and fewer opinions. Then lunch uptown with a minor poet who looked like he hadn't eaten since Roosevelt's first term. They exchanged words with the caution of fencers wearing gloves. Finally, a discreet arrival at the office of a doctor. Loring, whose brass plaque identified him as a psychoanalyst and whose receptionist wore the expression of someone who'd seen too much and been paid too little for it. Through it all, Beatrix moved like a woman choreographed in porcelain, fragile in image, unbreakable in structure. If she was mourning her husband, it didn't reach her shoes. If she was hiding something, she wore it as comfortably as perfume. And if I'd been hoping for a crack in the surface, I was going to have to get closer than the curb. She found me that evening, which is either flattering or alarming, depending on how you frame it. I was 3 blocks from her building, pretending to admire a storefront display of cufflinks shaped like playing cards, when her voice landed behind me like the tip of a rapier. "Mr. Goodwin, if I'd wanted Quentin dead, I'd have done it when he was still sleeping in my bed." I turned. She was impeccable. No hat, no haste, just icy decorum, and a handbag that could have concealed a derringer or a dictionary. I told her I was merely doing my job. She replied that surveillance was crude and grief was not a performance art. I'll admit I liked her for that. Not many people manage to dress me down without raising their voice or lowering their standards. She didn't ask me to stop following her. She told me to. Then she walked away, unhurried and unflinching, leaving behind the faint scent of lilac and something sharper, possibly contempt. By the time I got back to the brownstone, I had more questions than I'd started with. Wolfe, of course, had answers I hadn't earned yet. Wolfe was rereading Violet Interlude, which, in our house, is the equivalent of a priest re-examining a sermon after the sermon has already caused a riot. I asked if he was finding anything new. He didn't answer at first, just traced a line down the margin with a forefinger like a bishop translating scripture from the Greek. "This," he said finally, "is not fiction." He tapped the paper. "It is a transcription of guilt, awkward, embellished, and poorly veiled, but unmistakable. That makes Vale the world's most careless killer, or its most poetic victim," I said. He ignored that. "Observe how the narrator frames each act, not as plot, but penance. He is not revealing, he is surrendering. Each paragraph is an act of erasure disguised as art." "That's a lovely theory," I said. "Now explain why he ended up behind a wall panel." Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes. "Because confession is often offered too late, and because someone read this and recognized themselves, or feared they soon would." And with that, he reached for his beer and returned to the manuscript. I let him read. When Wolfe got this pensive, interrupting him was like tapping a bear during hibernation. Possible, but rarely wise. "Do you know," Wolfe said, eyes not leaving the page, "that absinthe, when steeped improperly, releases a bitter compound that mimics both perfume and poison?" I didn't, but I let him continue. "In this story, the wife infuses violet essence into the absinthe her husband drinks each night. It begins as seduction. It ends, predictably, as murder. And the twist? She frames a rival author. Naturally, the rival had once courted her. The prose is terrible, but the sentiment is, regrettably, authentic." I leaned against the cabinet. "You think it's a reimagining?" "I think it is an accusation buried in purple ink." Wolfe closed the manuscript. "The narrative arc is not fabricated. It is repurposed." "So Vale's story is someone's real life?" Wolfe gave a slight nod. "And someone, Mr. Goodwin, wanted it never to be read." Vincent Creel didn't need much prompting. He spoke like a man who'd been waiting for years to have an audience and wasn't about to let breath control ruin it. "Yes, Quentin had a muse," he said, fiddling with a long dead fountain pen as if it had been there at the scene. "She was bright, younger than him by a decade, and vanished without a goodbye or a funeral. I asked if she'd been the inspiration for any stories. He scoffed. He fictionalized everything, especially guilt. That was his genius, Warte, and his flaw." "You think she's dead?" "Does it matter?" he replied. "To Quentin she was more useful that way. A ghost can't object to being rewritten." There was a tightness in Creel's voice that didn't belong to literary rivalry alone. I asked if Vale had ever mentioned her directly. Only once. He said she'd been the only truth he ever lied about. Creel snorted. He thought that sounded clever. I thought it sounded dangerous. I left him at a cafe table, staring into a coffee he hadn't touched. Writers age poorly around secrets, and sometimes they remember too much to forget cleanly. 3 people, Wolfe said, understood Violet Interlude as autobiography: the author, the muse, and the one it threatened. He reached for a bottle of beer with fingers that moved as if orchestrating a lecture. That manuscript is a confession wrapped in cowardice, but more importantly, it is an invitation. To what? I asked. To discovery, he said. And someone read it. Someone for whom discovery equaled exposure. Thus, murder was not punishment, it was prevention. I nodded. So we're looking for the one who panicked. No, Wolfe said, we're looking for the one who recognized the mirror and could not bear the reflection. I caught Darren in the corridor of the gallery, eyes darting like a kid who'd seen a ghost and didn't want it to follow him home. He pulled me aside and whispered like a confessor who hadn't earned forgiveness. I know who left the violets, he said. His voice cracked on the last syllable. I leaned in. Then it's time to talk to Wolfe. He shook his head, panicked. Not yet. I just need to check something. I offered to walk him wherever he was going. He declined, said he'd come by the brownstone after dark. He didn't. By 10, I had called his flat. By midnight, I'd called twice more. And by morning, the silence was louder than any answer I could invent. It was a grey Tuesday, with nothing to recommend it except the fact that I hadn't yet stepped in anything irreversible. That changed when the call came from Hilda Morrow, who, in her usual brittle diction, informed me that her assistant, Darren Squires, was dead. The phrasing lacked drama, but not weight. The body had been found at the base of the gallery's freight elevator shaft, lying as neatly as a discarded umbrella. No visible wounds, no blood. Just a pale, vacant young man with all the life wrung out of him and his pockets turned inside out, as if death had frisked him on the way down. The police hadn't ruled anything, but the posture said accident, the stripped pockets said otherwise, and the fact that he'd spoken to me not 24 hours earlier about a secret worth keeping, that said murder. I got back to the brownstone before lunchtime, and Wolfe greeted the news with an expression somewhere between contempt and indigestion. He finished a mouthful of braised duck before speaking. 1 body is misfortune. 2, he muttered, reaching for a napkin, is a motif, which, in Wolfe's lexicon, meant it was no longer someone else's problem. The curtain had gone up on our part of the act. Wolfe had turned back to his lunch, which I took as a sign that he was officially absorbing responsibility. When Wolfe eats through bad news, it means he's preparing for the work ahead. 2 bodies, both connected to the same narrative construct, he said between bites. A gallery that reenacts murder, a manuscript that fictionalizes memory, and now a boy who knew too much. I nodded. So you're in? I am reluctantly compelled. He pushed the plate away with a finality that declared the duck a lesser priority. We have a murderer who edits with bullets and arranges scenes like tableau. This is not crime, it is dramaturgy. You're saying our killer's a playwright? I am saying, Wolfe corrected, that our killer is a revisionist, one who despises loose ends, especially the living kind. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with clarity. Very well. The case is ours. Kramer arrived the next morning with a face like curdled bourbon and the stride of a man who'd rather be anywhere else than on our doorstep, which in his case was almost always true. I suppose you think this confirms your theory, he growled as Fritz let him into the office. 2 deaths, and now we're doing Shakespeare. Wolfe barely looked up from his armchair. Inspector, I prefer Racine. More structure, less meandering. This isn't a drama, Kramer snapped. It's homicide. Your assistant's poking around crime scenes, your suspects are giving us the silent treatment, and now the kid's dead. He was not my assistant, Wolfe corrected with surgical coolness. He was a witness, possibly an inadvertent one, but nonetheless integral. Kramer pulled out his cigar, unlit, and turned it in his fingers like it might contain better dialogue. "You've got anything, you share it. Otherwise, stay out of my way." "I will do neither," Wolfe replied. "You may interpret that as defiance or courtesy, depending on your mood." Kramer didn't answer. He left the cigar unlit, the threat unspoken, and the tension thick enough to butter. When he'd left, Wolfe sighed. He dislikes being upstaged. "Who doesn't?" I said. "Except the dead." Wolfe, having committed to the playbill, decided it was time to probe the perfumer with more than pleasantries. "Delia Petrosian must be questioned again," he said. "I've questioned her twice." "Yes," he replied, "and with the sensitivity of a customs agent. Now ask her not as a consultant, but as a participant. There is an emotional residue to scent. She has left hers behind." That afternoon, I made the call. Delia answered in a voice that suggested she'd already been crying or had just stopped. "I'll come," she said simply. Wolfe didn't expect tears. He expected facts, though he knew better than most that the former often hid inside the latter. And when Delia arrived, she didn't bring grief. She brought memory, carefully bottled and ready to spill. Delia sat across from Wolfe with the posture of a woman preparing for trial. Not legal, but emotional. "Yes, I loved him," she said. Briefly, with the clarity that only comes before the disappointment. Wolfe inclined his head. "And afterward?" "He borrowed my scent formula," she continued. "He asked for something ephemeral, something that would linger without announcing itself. I gave him what I had, a blend of iris root, white moss, and a touch of ambergris. He wore it for months. And then? Then he used it in a story. A woman in a red shawl whose perfume haunted the man she left behind. Quentin changed the details, but I knew what it was." "You felt betrayed." She laughed, soft and bitter. "Not because he stole it, because he thought that was all I had to offer." Wolfe's eyes remained half-lidded, but I saw the shift. He'd begun to smell motive. "Did you love him still?" Wolfe asked. "No," she said. "But I remembered him, and sometimes that's worse." She told us, almost as an afterthought, about a request Quentin had made 2 months before his death. "He wanted something unusual," she said. "A scent that smelled like skin, not sweat or soap, just warmth. The way someone smells after you've held them too long." I blinked. Wolfe did not. "That is not standard perfumery," he said. "No," Delia agreed. "It's personal. He wanted to preserve someone. I think he wanted to summon her," Delia replied. "Or punish her. I couldn't tell which." Wolfe said nothing for a long time. Then, "Such an aroma would not be forgotten." Delia nodded. "Exactly." Later that evening, Wolfe asked Fritz for something not on the dinner menu. "Dig out the Tuileries formula," he said. "The 1897 variant, it contains methyl eugenol." Fritz raised an eyebrow, but complied. I asked, "You think our killer wore perfume?" "No," Wolfe said. "I think our killer understands memory, and how to preserve it in scent. They are not eliminating the past, Mr. Goodwin. They are embalming it." He sipped his beer with the satisfaction of a man who had finally found the right note. Vincent Creel answered his door in a wool vest and a look that could curdle paint. He didn't waste time pretending to mourn. "They chose him," he said, without invitation or ambiguity. Vale, the great Quentin Vale, wouldn't know a sentence if it bit him mid-clause. It had taken under 30 seconds to arrive at motive. "He plagiarized you." "He stole," Creel corrected, his voice sharp as a cracked phonograph. "The ideas, the tone, even a title once, The Light Behind the Fog. I wrote that in '52 for a university quarterly. 3 years later, he published Fog's End, changed enough words to keep his lawyer clean, but not enough to fool me. I didn't ask why he hadn't sued. He would have offered the answer anyway. I tried. His publisher backed him. said they couldn't verify the overlap. Cowards, all of them. Art suffers when truth is editorialized. I nodded solemnly and made a note. In Creel's world, justice was measured by column inches, and Vale had robbed him blind. Did you see him before he died? Creel laughed once, short and ugly. If I had, I'd have told him he was writing a tragedy, and not nearly fast enough. It wasn't a confession, but it was close enough to put in Wolfe's ledger under smouldering resentment. Getting information from Beatrix Vale was like drawing water from a stone fountain, elegant, slow, and never exactly satisfying. But she wasn't built for concealment, not entirely. I don't discuss Quentin's past, she said, sipping brandy at 3 p.m. I nodded. Even if it casts a long shadow? She met my gaze, calm as porcelain. He was a man who made mistakes, some private, some printed. He lived long enough to pretend the difference mattered. Did he ever mention a child? There it was, the flicker. Barely a breath's worth, but her hand paused on the glass. No, she said, he didn't need to. I didn't push. Wolfe had taught me that some lies sweat more when left alone. If she knew about a child, she wasn't ready to turn it into a headline. Not yet, but she had heard the rumor, and it was close enough to her heart to leave a mark. Delia Petrosian could have taught a course in evasion. I asked the question plainly, without garnish. Are you the mother of Quentin Vale's child? Her answer was silence, refined into performance. She tilted her head as if weighing the molecular structure of the air. I won't answer that. You just did. No, she said. I withheld. It wasn't the same. Wolfe would have agreed. Withholding is a form of preservation, like sealing a scent in amber and refusing to name it. I didn't press. Not because I was being polite, but because her silence had weight. Whatever she wasn't saying, it wasn't nothing. It was heavy. It was history. And for Wolfe, history was always the best place to plant a motive. Wolfe didn't speak for over an hour. He sat in his chair with Vale's manuscript in his left hand and a single violet in his right, like a priest deciding which deserved the greater funeral. The manuscript had acquired annotations. Wolfe's tight, angular scrawl marking certain phrases, looping arrows, underlined words. It had become a battlefield. The violet, on the other hand, remained whole, except for the tremor in Wolfe's fingers when he brought it near his nose. Orris Root, he murmured at last. Not dominant, but unmistakable. I nodded. Delia said she didn't use it. She lies, he said, or someone else borrowed her artistry. He set the flower down and leaned back, eyes closed. This is not random, it is architecture. I didn't ask for blueprints. When Wolfe spoke like that, he was halfway between deduction and sermon. But why violet? He opened his eyes. It is the scent of morning disguised as memory. Someone is trying to preserve something, and in doing so they have destroyed. He returned to the manuscript. I didn't interrupt again. Hilda Morrow answered her door with the brisk smile of someone prepared for war, and polite enough to offer tea first. I assume you're here to accuse me of something, she said. Not if you confess first. She sighed. Come in. The gallery was dimmer than before, or maybe her nerves were dimming it. Either way, she took her gloves off slowly, deliberately. The kind of motion people make when they know they're about to give something up. I knew about Quentin's past, she said. He told me years ago. Said he had once submitted a student's story as his own. Why tell you? Because I found out. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. The student was a friend, not mine, someone else's. But the plagiarism destroyed her career. She left school. He became Quentin Vale. I didn't need to ask what she'd done with the information. I asked for discretion, she said. And he paid. Not in cash, but in rights, in influence. A favor here, a manuscript there. I didn't ruin him. I merely kept him honest. Or frightened, I offered. She didn't answer. Wolfe would call it leverage. I called it motive. Either way, it made her more than a curator. It made her an editor with teeth. Wolfe didn't raise his voice. He rarely did. Not when the words were heavy enough to do the lifting on their own. 3 people, he said, understood that Violet Interlude was not invention. He set down the annotated manuscript. Quentin Vale, the woman he betrayed, and the person it threatened. I waited. But only one, he continued, knew how far it went. Only one had read not merely the story, but the subtext, and realized what was about to be named, and by whom. He didn't need to say the rest. The question wasn't who knew of the truth. It was who knew where the story ended, and how far Vale had planned to go in telling it. I opened the front door just after noon. There was no bell, no knock, just a shape left on the stoop like a calling card from a ghost. A 3rd bouquet, neatly arranged, no note. Same violet blend, same sickly, fragrant echo of whatever memory our killer was embalming. This time it had come to us. I brought it into the office and placed it on Wolfe's desk without a word. He looked at it, then me. That is not a gesture, it is punctuation. What kind? Emphatic. He didn't move to touch it. He didn't need to. The scent was already filling the room, quiet as a whisper and just as heavy. And whatever this was, warning, trophy, dare, it was Wolfe's now. And he wasn't going to let it fade. When the 3rd bouquet arrived, Wolfe didn't summon the police. He summoned me. Archie, he said, we must speak with Rosamund Bell. That wasn't a name I had expected to surface. Quentin Vale's longtime editor, former publisher's right hand, and the woman most likely to have rejected his early drafts with more elegance than explanation. She edited his last novel? She was his first reader, Wolfe replied. And the first mirror, he trusted. That afternoon, I placed the call. She answered in a tone I could have filed under prose with punctuation. I told her it was about Quentin Vale. She paused just long enough to confirm what Wolfe had suspected. Not grief, but guilt. I'll see you, she said. Tomorrow, no later. Wolfe nodded. She will come. And if she has any integrity left, she will bring her annotations. Rosamund Bell arrived in what I can only describe as tailored contrition. The suit was navy, the voice clipped, the demeanor well-worn but determined. I appreciate your interest, Mr. Wolfe, she said after pleasantries were dispatched like dust. But I never saw Violet Interlude. Wolfe didn't blink. You annotated it. She froze mid-pour of tea. The kettle trembled slightly, not from temperature. I beg your pardon? You made a notation, Wolfe continued. Page 12, margin left. You corrected a comma splice with a double stroke. Your hand curves left on initial ascenders, a habit common to editors trained on Remington standards. Shall I go on? She sat, carefully. I hadn't intended to, she said. But it was sent to me. He asked for thoughts, I obliged. Why deny it? Because it was never meant for press. It was a lapse, on his part, and mine. Wolfe leaned back, silent. Not victory exactly, but something close. I watched her hands. They stayed folded, but the fingers twisted faintly. A polite lie was giving way to a reluctant truth, and Wolfe, as always, had scented the hinge. Wolfe gestured toward the manuscript without touching it. You recognized yourself. Rosamund didn't reply immediately. Her eyes lowered, but not out of deference, more like a practiced retreat. I didn't expect him to write it, she said softly. We had history, but Quentin was fond of metaphor. I thought he'd disguise it better. He didn't, Wolfe replied. He immortalized you. She exhaled, long and quiet. And he buried me. Not effectively, Wolfe said, or not enough. I could feel the weight of the thing settle in the room like thick smoke. She had known. She had read the manuscript, and she had seen herself on the page, exposed, delicately veiled, and finally unmistakable. He had no right, she said. You believe that justified denial? Wolfe asked. Number it explains it. Rosamond spoke with a clarity that was almost clinical. It was a mistake, she said. We were both younger. He had a wife. I had a future. You chose the latter, Wolfe said. I vanished, she corrected. No obituary, no letters. I changed cities, jobs, my name, briefly. I became someone else and stayed that way. And he didn't respect that. He romanticized it. She smiled bitterly. To him, I was the woman who got away. To me, he was the man I outlived. I watched her closely. There was no trace of melodrama, just exhaustion aged into elegance. When I saw the story, I panicked, she continued. I thought, if it gets published, it begins again. The questions, the speculation. I didn't want to be part of his last confession. Wolfe inclined his head. Then you wished to erase it? No, she said, voice low. I wished it had never been written. Wolfe was still, but I could sense the coiled deduction behind his silence. Rosamond leaned forward. I asked him to pull it, she said. I told him the story would hurt more than it helped. I wasn't trying to threaten him. I was trying to end the resurrection. Wolfe's tone was flat. And he refused. He said it was his story to tell, that fiction was protection. I disagreed. You didn't kill him, Wolfe stated. It wasn't a question. No. She met his gaze. I didn't want him dead. I wanted the story gone. Wolfe nodded once, which for some is the same thing. When Rosamond left, composed but paler than she'd arrived, Wolfe remained silent for a stretch longer than usual. Then almost to himself he said, She didn't wield the weapon, but she provoked the page. I leaned in. Meaning? Someone else read it? Wolfe replied, voice low and precise, and saw a different story, one they feared or hated or longed to finish. He picked up the violet bouquet from the corner of his desk and examined it, not for aesthetics, but for evidence. This is not remorse, he murmured. It is punctuation. I knew that tone. He wasn't speculating, he was composing. Fritz returned with the results after dinner. He laid the folded note beside Wolfe's bier and withdrew. Wolfe read it once, lips tightening ever so slightly. Well? I asked. Methyl eugenol, he said. Illegal since 1958. Still used? Not legally, not without import license or intention. It is potent, traceable, and unmistakable. In perfume? In this one, he said. It was part of an older European blend. Discontinued for toxicity, not inefficacy. Only someone who knew scent intimately would dare use it now. I nodded. So the killer isn't just nostalgic, they're sloppy. Wolfe smiled thinly. No, Archie, not sloppy, just arrogant, which in murder is always the final mistake. He looked again at the bouquet, then away. The scent was still in the air, but the patience was running out. When Wolfe announced he required a demonstration, I knew better than to ask if it would involve pyrotechnics. For Wolfe, a demonstration involved logic arranged like stained glass. Precise, ornate, and never meant to be touched. My job was simple in theory and thankless in practice. Get them all into the office at the same hour without anyone bolting for the nearest cab. By some alchemy of threat and timing, I managed. Creel showed up scowling, Beatrix Vale wore a veil that did nothing to obscure her tension, Rosamond Bell arrived with a posture too upright to be natural, and Delia Petrosian drifted in with the composure of a woman who'd already buried what mattered. Hilda came last, carrying that eternal museum of a handbag. Wolfe didn't rise. He gestured once for silence, and the room obeyed. Not from reverence, but from anticipation, like the hush before a verdict. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, this is not theatre, though you may find it staged. It is exposition, structured and final. You may interject only if your conscience requires a rehearsal. It was not sarcasm, it was invitation. He folded his hands over his abdomen, glanced at the bouquet beside him, and began to take apart the past. Inspector Kramer arrived 5 minutes late, and 3 decibels above acceptable indoor volume. "You better have more than air and adjectives, Wolfe," he grunted, snapping his cigar case open like it had personally offended him. "Because if this is another damn lecture—" "It is," Wolfe interrupted mildly, "but one with consequence." Kramer muttered something that may have been ecclesiastical and took his usual seat, which he disliked and never refused. He shot me a glance. I returned it with my best poker face, which he interpreted correctly as, "I'm not the one who scheduled this show." "You've got 10 minutes, he growled. Wolfe closed his eyes for a second, as if computing the insult. Then he spoke, softly. "I shall require 15. Truth, I find, is not improved by haste." And just like that, the room belonged to him. Wolfe began with the violets. "They are not a calling card," he said, "nor an aesthetic indulgence. They are symbolic, mournful, modest, and intimate. But here they are functional. They serve to recreate an atmosphere not for the victim, but for the killer." He paused to let that settle. Even Creel stopped fidgeting. Someone recreated a moment, not for the audience, but for themselves. A scent, after all, is the most durable memory. It returns not with sight or sound, but with feeling. Whoever left those violets was not leaving a message. They were resurrecting something. Wolfe's gaze swept the room. That act, the precise placement of scent in a fabricated space, is not incidental. It is deliberate reanimation. Delia stiffened, just slightly. "And yet," Wolfe continued, "the perfume is not one publicly available. It is rather a formulation both illegal and specific. It connects us not to love or grief, but to obsession. And obsession," he said, "is seldom content with memory. It requires authorship." I didn't need to look around the room. I could feel it the moment the word authorship landed like a match in dry grass. Wolfe shifted only slightly, but it was enough to signal that the abstract was ending and the scalpel was being drawn. "There are only 3 criteria necessary to identify our culprit," he said. "First, access to the murder room and specifically to its concealed elements. Second, familiarity with perfume, not as consumer, but as artisan. And third, early access to Quentin Vale's manuscript." He turned his gaze, now sharp, now narrowed, to each in turn. "Only one of you meets all 3. He let the silence lengthen. Beatrix inhaled sharply. Hilda clutched her gloves. Delia said nothing. "The killer did not kill in anger," Wolfe continued. "They killed to prevent a revelation, and because, in the mind of the murderer, memory was more powerful than justice." Wolfe's tone lowered, but his words landed harder. Vale's manuscript did more than fictionalize an affair. It revealed, obliquely but unmistakably, the existence of a child abandoned, a child unclaimed. He didn't name Delia, not yet. In the manuscript, the character dies before acknowledging the child. But in life, Vale intended to make it public. He had told at least one person, perhaps more, that the final chapter would name names. Delia's hand moved toward her necklace. It trembled there. And so, Wolfe said, he had to be silenced, not out of rage, but out of protection, or revenge disguised as shame. He allowed the room to feel the chill. "This murder was not an end," he said. "It was an edit." Wolfe turned toward Delia as though preparing to recite a eulogy. His voice was neither cruel nor triumphant. It was solemn. "Miss Petrosian," he said, "you are a master of scent. You created the formula used in the murder room. You had the keys to the gallery, and you were the one person Quentin Vale trusted with the manuscript before it was delivered to his publisher." Delia didn't move. Her face, pale but composed, had gone marble still. "You loved him," Wolfe continued, "and perhaps you forgave him. But when he refused to acknowledge your son, when he chose fiction over fact, you decided to write the ending yourself." He held up the ribbon from Creel's typewriter, encased in a plastic sleeve. "You planted this to frame him. You staged the violets as homage and deception. But what gave you away was the scent. You used an ingredient that no perfumer would include now unless they were trying to recreate a formula, one linked not to memory, but to intimacy. Delia's eyes finally dropped. Wolfe didn't need to press. The final line had been read. She didn't cry. I'll give her that. Delia's voice, when it came, was quiet and unwavering. He said it didn't matter, that the boy was grown, that truth now would do more harm than good. She looked not at Wolfe, but at the bouquet. He wouldn't even name him, she said. Just wrote it down. As if that were enough. Her breath shuddered once, and then she straightened. I didn't mean to shoot him. I brought the gun because I was afraid he'd laugh. She looked at Creel. The typewriter was to mislead. The violets. I suppose they were for me. And Darren? Wolfe asked. Her lips parted. He saw me afterward, with the flowers. I begged him not to tell, but he wasn't sure. So She stopped. Not for lack of words, but because there were no decent ones left. Kramer stood. He didn't speak yet. Wolfe gave a single nod. Justice had never smelled so bitter. As Kramer led Delia out, no cuffs, not yet, he paused by Wolfe's chair, holding his usual contempt in check, just long enough to taste irony. You know, he muttered, if you ever get tired of orchids, you could join homicide. We could use a little poetry. Wolfe didn't look up. You'd make a poor gardener, Inspector? You uproot too quickly? Kramer grunted and disappeared down the hall. I stood at the door, watching the scent of violets vanish in her wake. Wolfe reached for his beer. Not like a toast, more like punctuation. Outside, the world resumed. Inside, the case had ended. Not with applause, but with the quiet collapse of something once fragrant, now only faint. After it all, the speeches, the confession, the click of the front door as Kramer led her away. The brownstone settled back into its native state of inertia. The quiet wasn't new, but this kind carried a weight. The kind of stillness that doesn't wait for applause. Wolfe had returned to the plant rooms. From the front office I could hear the occasional sigh, the misting bottle's soft hiss, and the low grumble that usually accompanied orchids needing more care than appreciation. He hadn't spoken a word since Delia had been escorted out. I hadn't either. We were both letting the dust settle, him in silence, me with a scotch, and the day's newspaper I had no intention of reading. What lingered most wasn't the case or the confession, it was the scent, the damn violets. Even with the office windows open, the perfume clung to the walls like regret. Wolfe, when he finally re-entered, sniffed the air with a grimace worthy of Greek tragedy. Wasted, he said, brushing his hands as if ridding them of pollen or failure. A waste of art, of feeling, of scent. I said nothing. There wasn't much to add when the man who'd read the room, and everyone in it, was already offering his closing argument. The phone rang late, just after 9, and I picked it up expecting a cold call or a hot complaint. Instead, it was Beatrix Vale. Her voice had changed, still precise, still wrapped in a velvet accent, but something had lowered in it. The register of grief, or maybe relief. I wanted to thank Mr. Wolfe, she said, for not allowing it to stay buried, the story, I mean. Quentin? He never stopped writing people into corners. I suppose it was fitting someone wrote him out of one. I said I'd pass it along. And Archie? She added. Yes, ma'am. He told me once that truth was never polite. I'm beginning to think it isn't quiet either. The line went dead, but her words stayed in the room a moment longer than the dial tone. When I relayed them to Wolfe, he made a sound, not quite approval, not quite disdain. Politeness is a function of restraint, he murmured. Truth has no such discipline. Wolfe didn't speak again until the following morning. I found him at the dining room table, a poached egg gone cold beside his untouched toast, gazing out the window as if the leaves in the courtyard were spelling something worth translating. She tried, he said with no preface. Delia, She tried to destroy a memory by embalming it. That is the paradox, Archie. You do not kill remembrance with ritual. You feed it. I sat silently. I'd learned by now when Wolfe wanted an audience, not a debate. Violets, he continued, are modest flowers, not flamboyant. They do not bloom to be seen. They bloom to endure. When used to mark a murder, they do not become theatrical. They become tragic. He lifted his glass of water, swirled it once, and did not drink. There are crimes of rage and crimes of reason. This was neither. This was a crime of remembrance. And those, he said, are the most difficult to forgive. He returned his gaze to the courtyard. And impossible to forget. By late afternoon, the last bouquet had started to wilt. I took it from its crystal vase, wrapped it in yesterday's headlines, and tossed it into the kitchen trash like an afterthought I didn't want to explain. But even buried beneath eggshells and lemon rinds, the perfume stayed. Faint, persistent, like a song you don't realize you remember until you hear the third note. Wolfe said nothing when he saw the empty table. He just raised an eyebrow and resumed reading. There was no need to mark the act. We both knew it was symbolic. Not ceremonial, just final. The kind of finality you get in our line of work, where closure means no one's asking questions, but no one's really sleeping easy either. That evening, Wolfe made one last comment. To no one, and therefore to everyone. Flowers, he said, do not shout. They suggest. He was seated in his chair, hands folded on his stomach, like a critic waiting for the curtain call that never comes. Lilies imply virtue, roses, appetite. Violets, violets whisper. Their scent lingers because it was never meant to arrive like a storm. It arrives like a memory. I didn't interrupt. When Wolfe philosophized in full bloom, it was best to let him finish the thought or be swept into it. This time, he said, a woman turned memory into vengeance. But the violets? The violets only told the truth. They did not intend to, but they told it nonetheless. He didn't look at me or expect a reply. The remark was not for me. It was for the room, and perhaps for the woman who'd made them speak. I wrote the final note in Wolfe's case file just before midnight, in the kind of quiet that only follows resolution or exhaustion. Wolfe had gone to his room. Fritz had long since retreated. Outside, the city had nothing left to confess. Before I shut the folder, I glanced again at the label we'd attached, the violets in the murder room. Wolfe had approved it with the usual grunt. He'd said it was accurate, which for him was high praise. His last words still floated in the air, quiet and etched. Justice is rarely fragrant, but this time it left a scent no one will forget. I closed the file, and for once I didn't disagree. Some crimes are born not of hatred, but of memory, the kind too heavy to carry, too dangerous to release. In this case, violets didn't bloom for love, but for grief that festered in silence, until scent became signature and justice came perfumed in irony. Wolfe, in his chair among the orchids, saw it plainly. The past has roots that twist deep, and no fiction can hide the truth forever. Do you believe remembrance can drive someone further than rage, and perhaps deeper than guilt? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.